How are you? Okay, how are you? All right, okay, good. I know this is like the time of the afternoon where typically you sleep, and they did just turn off the lights, but I will try and be as loud and obnoxious as possible in order to keep you awake. So, my name is Pamela Fox. I'm a product engineer at Coursera, and today I want to talk about feature detection in the real world. So this shit's gonna get real. All right, so you guys are in a Chrome track, and presumably you guys are all on the Chrome track and doing web development stuff, and you're probably all pretty excited about HTML5, right? Woo! So HTML5 is awesome because it's bringing us all these things that for years and years we wanted as web developers, and we had to do all these crazy hacks in order to do them, and finally the browsers are just making it really easy for us, right? I remember once spending 2 months implementing rounded corners on this little gadget back when I was working at Google, and finally getting it to work in IE6, and then taking it to UX review with Marissa and finding out that apparently we didn't do rounded corners at Google. So stuff like that, right? These days, it would take me one line of code to put a border radius on there and then get it rejected, and hey, life would go on, right? So HTML5 is great because we get all these new features, but we're getting them incrementally, right? So we have them in some browsers, we don't have them in other browsers, we have kind of parts of the features in some, and they don't quite work. So that means we actually have to worry about whether a particular feature is actually supported, because most of us probably have to actually develop things for multiple browsers. You know, if we could, we'd probably just tell all of our users, like, hey, just use Chrome. I've tried that. Kind of works. So what do? We think to ourselves like, all right, I want to use this feature, but first I need to see if it's supported. How should I do that, right? The obvious thing to do is to ask the browser, like, hey, I want to use this feature. Do you use that, right? And we do that via this technique that we call feature detection, right? And we have various ways of actually doing feature detection. So here are some examples, right? If we want to know if a browser supports some JavaScript API, we might ask, okay, does window.webkit audio context exist? If it does exist, then this browser presumably supports that particular JavaScript API. If we're trying to see if a particular HTML element works, right, we can try creating the HTML element and seeing if it gets particular attributes automatically applied to it by the browser, right? If we want to know if some CSS works, we can just create an element and see if that style property is actually a key on that element. And most of us probably use Modernizer, which is a library that does these detections for you behind the scenes. And then you just ask Modernizer, hey, does this work, right? So that's feature detection, and it sounds like it's actually really great, right? All we have to do is say, we want to use this feature, just tell the browser, hey, tell us if it works, right? So it's really, really awesome when it works, right? It's a great idea. However, it doesn't always work. Right? Sometimes it's impossible to detect a feature. Sometimes you get false negatives, positive falsities, whatever you want to call them, all those things, and you need a different plan. And a lot of times what you do instead is use user agent detection, right? And this is where we just look at the navigator.userAgent and we try to understand what device and what browser a user is using. So a very basic check here. If I want to know if they're on an iPad or iPhone, I'm just looking for iPhone or iPod in that user agent doing a regex here. This is where we have a lot of regexes. I hate regexes, so I will never make these up myself, but they get worse, right? So if I want to check for mobile browsers, maybe the top mobile browsers, right? Here's a check that gets a bit more of a crazier regex that's going to get me, you know, maybe the top 10 mobile browsers, right? But it's not that simple, right? There's a lot more browsers out there and devices in the world, especially as you go international. I know a lot of you are from outside America, and I'm sure you have Android devices that I've never even heard of, right? So if you really wanted to check for every mobile browser, you get something like this. I think this is from mobilebrowserdetect.com. And as you can see, there's a lot of mobile browsers in the world, right? Do you actually need to check for all of them? I don't know. I don't know what you're doing. But this is an example of how intense user agent sniffing can be. And we usually don't want to do user agent sniffing for a couple reasons, right? First of all, we have to write regexes, and I don't know about you, but I don't like regex. And so the thing is, it's very easy to get it wrong. It's generally easy to get regexes wrong, but it's also really easy to get user agents wrong, because user agents, they're kind of these crazy strings that browsers come up with, and browsers are always trying to fool developers into thinking that they're not what they used to be, right? So I think the new IE10 has gotten rid of it got rid of something in its user agent string that people normally sniff for to find out that it's IE, because IE10, they don't want you thinking it's IE anymore because it's, it's cool now, right? And then, oh, you guys didn't get that memo. Okay, so, and then some browsers, like if you're viewing IE with Chrome frame, it'll tell you Chrome in the user agent, but then Chrome frame might not actually be running on the page, so that's kind of confusing. And then of course, every user agent string in the world has Mozilla, because that was the original dupe. So user agent detection can be really tricky, and it also means that when you're detecting a user agent, if that user agent eventually does come to support a feature, you've prematurely blocked it, right? If you say like, hey, Safari doesn't support this feature, we're not gonna use this feature in Safari, and then Safari tomorrow comes out with a release that supports that feature, you've probably moved on to other things. The chance that you're actually gonna update that bit of code that blocks Safari users is really small, right? So we don't like user agent detection because it's often not future thinking, right? It can really easily leave us in a state where parts of our site aren't working as well when they actually could be, because these browsers do move fast. But it is a tool that we can use, right? So here's the thing, we have these tools, feature detection and user agent sniffing, and a lot of people will tell you like, hey, you gotta use feature detection, you gotta use feature detection, that's the only way. And I do try to, but I've run into all these cases where it hasn't quite worked, and I've had to use other techniques instead. So I wanted to share those with you so that hopefully when you guys are working on using these fancy new features yourself, you'll know what to look out for and you know how to react yourself so that you can spend less time figuring out how to detect things and just move on to actually making stuff happen, which is what we all want to do, right? So let's talk about a few cases. Local storage is this cool, lightweight storage API. It's actually supported in quite a few browsers now. It's from the W3 web storage spec. And it's a very simple key value store that you can access from JavaScript and use to store and cache data from your application, right? And I thought it was really cool, so I wrote a library on top of local storage called LSCache, which was inspired by Memcache, which is a tool we use on the server, and would allow me to store stuff in local storage with a particular expiration, and then they would get automatically kicked out. So in this library, I thought it would be responsible of me to actually check to see if local storage worked in the browser before I attempted to store anything in it, right? So I needed to figure out how to do this detection. So I started off with the most basic thing I could do, which is, okay, is local storage on window and not null? Then, therefore this browser supports the local storage API. That was my very naive first attempt. But what happened is that you could have local storage supported by a browser. It didn't mean you could actually use it. Because it could be that the browser was currently in incognito mode and doesn't let you store local storage. It could be that the local storage was over quota. It could be just for whatever reason, there was one version of iPad where they just turned it off. So the only way you can actually check to see if local storage works is to try and use it the way you want to use it. So my local storage check then turned into this, which is, okay, let's try to set an item in the cache and remove the item from the cache. And if we're able to do that and we don't get any exceptions during that time, then okay, local storage works, right? So the only way I could actually check this was to use it exactly the way I wanted to be able to use it, right? So I went to that check. Now, even that caused me some problems. So I was using this in a mobile web app. It was a PhoneGap hybrid app. And I noticed that my web app was taking a long time to load, and I was trying to get this load time down. So I profiled it, right? I put little, new date in between all the things that it did, and I tried to figure out why is it taking so much time just to get to this main screen. And I found it was actually taking something like 300 milliseconds on Android in order to get through this local storage detection check. Because in my code I had, script source equals lscache.js, it would execute that code, and that code would immediately do the local storage detection check. So what I realized was I needed to stop doing that detection check, on page load, and defer it, only do it later when I actually needed it, right? So what I did is I made a little cached variable to remember whether local storage works, because we don't want to do this check all the time, right? We just want to do it once. So basically what happens every time you try to use lscache, it will check to see have we figured out yet that it works? Okay, if we haven't, let's do that check, let's remember it, and then next time when they use it, we'll remember, right? So what I learned here is that you have to be careful when you're checking if something supports an API, not just that it supports it, but it supports the way you want to use it, right? I mean, with local storage, you can actually be in a mode where you could read it, but you wouldn't be able to write. But maybe you only care about reading, in which case you should just check for that, right? So there's a lot of subtleties to when we say something is supported or works. It's a bit more complex than that. You also need to make sure that you don't let feature detection slow down your site, right? It's always simple to do everything up front, do all your checks up front, and then you can always have it there. But you don't want to sacrifice the user's loading performance just for simplicity, right? This is the unfortunate thing, is pretty much when it comes to performance, your code can start off beautiful. As soon as you start worrying about performance, your code's not going to be beautiful anymore. You're going to have to implement caching, and it's not going to look very clean. But sometimes we have to make our code look not as beautiful in order for users to have a better experience, right? So we sacrifice a little bit of developer happiness for a little bit of user happiness. And I know that's really hard for us to give up, but it's important. And along with this, every time I encountered something with this feature detection, I thought to myself, okay, what would I want out of browsers? What could browsers give to me as a developer that would have made it easier for me in this case? So here, it would have been awesome if I could just ask the browser, like, hey, browser, can I use local storage in a read mode? Can I use local storage in a write mode? Okay, great. And then the browser could figure out the most optimal way of checking, and it wouldn't be up to me, right? So the good thing about browsers, having browsers give us these checks, is that they could do it in a very fast way, in a very efficient way, ways that I couldn't necessarily do because I'm not going behind the scenes in the browser code, right? So I hope that this is something that browsers do going forward with things like the storage APIs, and I think that IndexedDB actually does have stuff like this. So they learn. All right, woo! So then we had, we have this thing called FORMDATA. FORMDATA is another addition to HTML5. And it's something that lets you take data from all your form inputs, serialize it, send it in an XML HP request, right? The idea is that you don't have to use jQuery AJAX anymore, right? And I thought, oh, this is really cool, right? And I saw all the Google DevRelers were tweeting about how cool FORMDATA was, and I was like, man, I want to be cool like them. I want to use FORMDATA, right? So I implemented it for a sign-up form on this website I made last year. So that when you signed up, it would go through this code here, which would say, okay, if window.formData, we're just starting with this basic check, if window.formData, create the new form data from the form, do a new XHR, send that form data to the XHR. If not, then we just go down to our AJAX technique, right? So I was like, okay, this is awesome. I've been all proper, and I've implemented the feature detection check, and I've done a fallback technique, and I tested it, and it works, and it's great. And I put it out there, and I tweeted about it, and I felt really good. But then I got all these reports from Safari users that they weren't able to sign up. I was like, well, this is not very good, right? Sign up is somewhat a crucial part of an application, right? So I was like, what is this? Why can't they sign up on Safari? Because it worked fine on my Safari, right? And I realized that there was this particular version of Safari. It was like 5.1.50 or whatever, only on Macs, maybe on Windows. But this particular version of Safari where FORMDATA didn't quite work. It pretended to work, but it didn't actually work. And what would actually happen is that when you created that FORMDATA object, it would create it and pretend it all worked, but then there was nothing in it, which is kind of horrible because people would be trying to sign up and there would be no data going to my server, so I couldn't even find out what email address they put in order to tell them like, oh, hey, I fixed it, right? Because I was getting an empty string. So that was pretty bad. And the other bad thing is that there was no way to actually do a detection check for this because FORMDATA has no accessors. You can't ask FORMDATA to tell you what's in it, to say, get a key out, give me the length of what's in there. It's just this, this blob that you can't look inside and maybe there's nothing in it. So I was like, okay, I'm going to have to just blacklist Safari, right? Because I knew it had a problem and that was my only option, right? So I ended up coming up with a detection, user agent sniffing for Safari. And I said, okay, if window.formdata and we're not in Safari, then let's go send it on, right? And I could have done like the very specific version of Safari, but I didn't want to, if they introduce the bug in one version, who's to say they're not going to introduce it in another version? So I just wanted to move on with life and get it over with, right? So what I learned here is that it sounds really, these new APIs, they seem really exciting. And if you're, if you're around, if you go to conferences a lot, like you guys might, you hear about these new APIs and you're like, oh, that's so cool. I'm going to go home and implement it immediately for my app. And you get really excited. But you got to be careful about using new APIs because the bugs in them are new. They're not documented. They, new bugs will come up in recent versions of the browsers. And especially if you're doing something, if it's some mission critical part of your site, like sign up, I wouldn't recommend trying out a new API there, right? If it's a mission critical part of your site, then just go with the old techniques, right? They might not be as cool, but we've had them for years. And people have tested them, and people know what all the bugs are with file upload in IE7, and they've figured that out in libraries. So I would say, try and use those old APIs and libraries that people have written because they're battle tested, and you don't want to be using something so new and shiny for something that's so important. Now for browsers, we really need accessors for anything that has storage in it, right? Like with local storage, if there was no accessor, I would have had no way of knowing that it actually successfully stored something, right? So this is something that they should add to any sort of API like this. Okay, so now let's talk a bit about CSS. Because this is something that you can run into as well, because we have a lot of fancy CSS now, right? We've got shiny animations and transforms. So I was working on that mobile web app, right, using PhoneGap, and I had this embedded web view, and I decided to do it as a mobile web app because I already knew HTML, CSS, and I was like, hey, I already know HTML, CSS, I'm just going to use it to make this app, it'll be great, I don't have to learn something new. And at the time, I was doing it for both iPhone and Android, and only iPhone had a set of design guidelines. Android hadn't really come up with anything yet. So I just followed the iPhone design guidelines. And there were a lot of like rounded corners and gradients, and they kind of look really bubbly. And luckily CSS3 made it really easy to make something look iPhone-y. Because we have, the box shadow and the gradient and the border radius and all of that, right? So I had my app. And it was all good, and I was feeling good having it out on the markets there. But then what happened is I was using Android at the time, and I would notice from time to time that the entire screen would just go completely white, right? And I would be unable, there would just be nothing there anymore, and I would have to like restart the app or somehow go back. And it was kind of useless, right? You can't use an app that's just a white screen. It's highly unfunctional. So I was like, okay, clearly something is not working in this app that I need to work out. And I kind of had a suspicion that maybe Android didn't like all this fancy CSS. I'd kind of heard rumors that Android wasn't so good with new CSS3 stuff. So I suspected that it was having a trouble actually rendering this. So what I did was I spent an entire afternoon sitting there, commenting out CSS, redeploying my APK to my phone, scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, waiting to see if I got a white screen. That was probably one of those boring afternoons of my life. And so eventually I did figure out that if I commented out enough of the fancy CSS, that I wouldn't get white screens anymore. And I didn't want to have to sit there and figure out exactly how much CSS Android can handle, because it was just really boring. So I decided, well, you know what? I'm just going to get rid of all of it, right? I'll take away the border radius, the gradients, the box shadows, And so it ended up looking really flat. Then, conveniently, Android came out with their design guidelines, which were the opposite of iPhone's, and their design guidelines were flat, not gradient, square. I was like, wow, that's perfect. It's like you knew that you were incapable of handling CSS3. So that worked out really well, actually. But the thing is that I still wanted to have the iPhone look and feel for iPhone users and the Android look and feel for the Android users, and I was doing this from the same code base. So I needed to detect Android. So you can see here the transformation from the iPhone to the Android. So to detect Android, it's a little more complex than you would imagine. I was doing the standard user agent check for popular Android devices. I was also using the PhoneGap API that they provide for checking device. And I was also checking the URL parameter because I test my mobile web app in the browser as well. So I wanted to be able to just fake Android when I was testing the browser. But finally, when I decide it's Android, I add the Android class to the body tag. And then in my CSS, I can just say, oh, okay, if we're looking at a modal class inside the Android body class, then just reset all these fancy things, right? Box shadow none, no border radius, get rid of all of that, reset it all to 0. And that worked. So what I learned here is that just because something is supported does not mean it's supported well, right? It's really easy to throw in support for these things. It's much harder to make them work really well and be really performant, especially for this CSS3 stuff, right? So you really need to check for that. And especially if you're using these features in bulk, right? Part of my problem was that I had a kind of an infinite scrolling interface. So there was potentially lots and lots of these features that were kind of building up and being used by the browser. I think if I only had, a limited amount of usage of it, I probably could have more easily controlled it and predicted how it would perform. But since I had more and more of this CSS3 features building up, I think that contributed to Android kind of freaking out and going, oh, there's too many. I'm just guessing that's what Android does. So if you have any sort of interfaces which potentially get bigger and bigger amounts of content and don't have a finite cap, really be careful about your performance there, right? I worked on the Google Wave team years ago, and we had that problem with waves, right? Waves that got way too long. They just had too much DOM inside them, so we really had to look at that DOM and say, okay, we probably shouldn't be using a table to make all of our buttons, right? Because that really, really adds up when you get these really long waves. So definitely any place where you've got this scrolling or lots of things adding up, look out for it. Now for browsers, I just want browsers to know their limits, right? I would much rather that Android realize that it couldn't render my fancy CSS and just not done it, right? Instead of pretending it could do it and then rendering a white screen. Because white screens are really not easy to use, right? It's like worse than blue screens. At least blue screens, it's a blue screen of death. You're like, oh, okay, it died. I'm just going to restart it. White screens, it's like, I don't know what's going on here. It's kind of abstract. So browsers should just know their limits, right? And so should all of us. Okay. So finally, I want to talk about a sign-up process that we have at Coursera that I helped on a few months ago. So we introduced this thing called Signature Track, which is a way of taking courses while verifying your identity. And there are a few technical components of Signature Track, and we wanted to make sure that people knew about these technical requirements before they signed up, because I didn't want users to get halfway through this multi-step sign-up process and then realize that there was no way they would have been able to complete it, and then they get all mad, like, Coursera, why you tease me like that? So these were the requirements were that you needed to have a physical keyboard, because we do this keystroke biometrics algorithm, and it doesn't work so well on soft keyboards. So we wanted you to have a real physical keyboard. You needed to have a webcam, because we took a picture of your face every time you took a quiz and when you signed up, and to match it to your ID. So we couldn't have you do it if you didn't have a webcam. And you needed to have a modern browser, and also you needed to have Flash, because we were using Flash to get the webcam stuff. I know that you can do an HTML5, but it didn't work so well. So I needed to figure out how to do checks for all of these. The first thing was a physical keyboard. And that was a little tricky because there's no such thing as asking the browser if there's a physical keyboard attached. So we said, all right, well, maybe we should just look to see if it's a touch device. So we started off with this check here, like, oh, is on touch start in window or document touch? Then, okay, we're on a touch device. And we rolled that out, but we immediately got cases where it thought you were on a touch device and you weren't, and vice versa. And people would actually have physical keyboards, and we're like, all right, we are just going to blacklist mobile browsers. So basically, you're only going to be able to do this on your desktop browser, and we'll give you a link to let us know that if you actually do have a physical keyboard, we'll give you that option, right? So we ended up doing that because we needed something. I just needed something that worked to get this out fast. But the thing is, we would tell people, right? So for every time I would detect something about a user, I would let them know, like, hey, this is the reason that we're not letting you do it, so that then they could see, and then they could contact us and say, oh, hey, you say that you blocked me because I didn't have a hard keyboard, but actually I do. And then we could decide to unblock them, or we could change our blocking process, right? We haven't gotten any emails about that check yet, so I guess it's kind of working. Now, I just want to give an aside now on touch events, because touch events are really, really interesting things. And there's been a lot of very interesting articles lately about touch events and whether you should be supporting them or detecting them and how. So here's, if we want to look for touch events, there's a couple things we have to do across different browsers to find out if that browser is capable of doing touch events. But there's a difference between a browser supporting touch events and the user actually using touch events, right? So if you're on an Android tablet, you could still connect a mouse to your tablet, right? And you could actually potentially be using a website and switching between using a mouse and using your finger on the same web page, right? So that means as a developer, you shouldn't be relying on just the fact that something's a touch device as meaning that you should just be doing everything reacting to touch. Because a lot of times the users can connect these other devices as well. And I think this is going to become more and more common that we'll have these devices that are both. I mean, we all just got that Chrome Pixel, right? And the Chrome Pixel is a touchscreen and a keyboard, and you have a little mousey down there, right? So this is becoming more and more the reality. So we have to be really careful that when we're looking for touch, that we consider the fact that they could still be using click events, right? So the standard way, or the one way that you could actually not care about this is that you could listen to a touch event, and if you get a touch event, you would just trigger your listener for the click event, and basically they would both do the same thing, right? So that way the user could go between using touch and using click, and your web page should respond exactly the same way. So if you are doing anything right now or thinking about doing something where you're detecting touch events and doing something different, think to yourself, how would this work if the user also had a mouse attached? How would it work if they switched between the mouse and the touch screen halfway through the interaction, right? That's kind of the trickiest, but it could happen, right? And there's some really interesting articles about that there. Okay, so that's an aside. All right, we also need to detect the Flash plugin, and I just used the Swift object library for this, which is it's a nice, well-supported library, and it'll even tell you the Flash player versions in case you want to support particular versions. And I also wanted to check for webcam. Unfortunately, there is no way to check for a webcam unless you actually put up the webcam prompt and ask the user to give permission, right? And I wanted to check for this before they even got to the webcam part of the process. So I gave up, and we put up a little modal that said, hey, remember, you need a webcam. And presumably, if they saw that and decided to keep going, even though they didn't have a webcam, well, that's their prerogative. So sometimes you just can't detect things, and you have to accept that. So in this case, I learned that you can't detect things all the time, and you have to do different things. And if you do decide to block users, which can be a bad thing, but if you do block them, tell them why you block them, give them an option to contact you, and explain what their particular setup is, and maybe you'll realize then that the code you're using could actually be much improved. And for browsers, I would really like for browsers to give us a way to detect those physical devices and plugins, right? So I wouldn't have to go through all this effort to try and figure it out. So something like, is there a physical keyboard? Are they using it right now? Do they have a webcam? Do they have Flash? Those would have all made my life much, much easier. All right, so to finish up, This is a reminder of why this all matters. This is a visualization of browser support for a particular feature, and there's lots more visualizations of this. But the point is that, yeah, we're going to have unequal distribution of feature support for a long time going forward. Basically forever, right? People will keep coming up with new things. Browsers will keep not implementing them at the same rate, keep implementing in different ways with different performance concerns, with different attributes supported, and we're gonna just have to keep dealing with that, right? So this is something that we're gonna have to think about for years to come. Now browsers are aware of this and browsers are trying to help. So browsers, they did introduce this CSS conditionals level 3 spec, which actually has this @supports rule for CSS where you can say, oh, hey, does this browser actually support this CSS? And then you could serve different styles. And they've got the same thing in JavaScript, window.supportCSS. And this is actually supported by 3 browsers now. So the cool thing is that browsers are actually realizing that, yeah, this is something developers care about and they're trying to come up with more ways for us to figure it out. But this is really cutting edge, and most of you, we won't be able to use this quite yet, right? So in the meantime, what should you re-strategy? First of all, don't assume it's going to be easy, because sometimes it's not, and if you assume it's easy, you might look for an easy solution and overlook all the complexities. Don't just copy the first answer off Stock Overflow, which is something I do a lot, but I'm trying to cut back on it. Do use the tried and true techniques, right? So use popular and well-tested libraries. Look at the number of forks, the number of issues, the number of contributors. Look at how recently the change was. Browse through the issue tracker and see what people say about it, right? And if you're not sure, just ask, right? When I was trying to figure out the signature track process, I just emailed my buddies on the Chrome team and said, hey, is there anything I'm not thinking of here, right? And now we don't all have buddies on the Chrome team, but we do all have Paul Irish's Twitter account. So I recommend just tweeting at him because he really likes to answer these things and he's got the lowdown, right? So don't be afraid to ask. There's a lot of people out there that'll answer. And do try feature detection first, right? So use Modernizer and you can see all the different ways of using it. Also, if you do need to do user agent detection, use this library called UA Parser. It's maintained by BrowserStack and contributed by Google and Facebook. So it's got a lot of great, well-tested regexes in it, and it's supported in lots of different languages. And you can also mix and match, right? You can see if something works and then maybe blacklist it for certain browsers that you know have problems, right? Certain browsers and versions, that's the best kind of blacklist. So basically, the conclusion here is that we don't have that. Do you guys know what that is up there? Yeah, so that's a sonic screwdriver from Doctor Who, and basically it can do everything, right? We don't have something that can do everything. We don't have the perfect solution in web development. That's just how it is. But we do have a lot of tools in our toolbox, and we can learn how to use those tools, and we can combine them together, and we can try and use the more sophisticated ones first. And we also have each other so that we can learn from each other about how to learn these tools, right? So we're not alone in it. So when you're figuring this out, look to each other for the solutions, document what you find out, write it up, open source your code, and then we'll all learn how to do all this detection together so that we can fully take advantage of everything the web has for us today. Got it? Done. So questions, yeah? Anyone have questions? Speechless. Doctor Who episodes, perhaps? The little microphone-y thing there.
Okay, so there seems to be kind of an underlying theme to all of this, and that is you're doing all this checking. It almost feels like you're trying to implement what you can when you can, rather than trying to develop to implement or to cover as many browsers as possible and then dealing with exceptions. Am I just kind of reading into that the wrong way, or?
So you're wondering, am I trying to use new things? Am I trying like overly hard to use new things versus using the older things?
No, I wouldn't say overly hard, but it seems like, and not just you, I see a lot of developers out there, I feel like there's this push, this emphasis to use everything possibly available, even if it causes 10 times the work.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, right? I think that we see the new stuff and we get really excited about it, and it makes us feel good to try out the new stuff because we feel like we're on the cutting edge. It's kind of like not invented here syndrome, right? Like it helps us kind of feel like inventors if we're using the new stuff too, and we're going on it alone. But it's true. So nowadays, like at Coursera, most of the time I will just try and go with the tried and true techniques now, because now that I've had this much experience with trying the new stuff, I like knowing that it's there. But I also know that if I'm going to try it out, I'm probably going to be one of the first people to really try it out in a big app, and I'm going to have to struggle with figuring that out. And sometimes I'm up for that challenge because it can be quite interesting, but sometimes I just want it to work.
Okay, so I hadn't quite formed the question until now that you've said that. In your experience, these things that are out there, are they generally stable enough that it's okay for the better part of the user base to try to use them and deal with them, or should, if you've got to really deal with the general public, should you just stick with those tried and true methods?
It really depends on what they are. Some of them have been out there for longer than others. I guess I've experienced even with local storage that browsers introduce new bugs, and it's even been around for a couple years. We use HTML5 video at Coursera, and we still have a lot of problems with it, and it's been out for a year or so. So we've started defaulting users to Flash instead.
Okay, that right there says a lot.
So sometimes there are advantages to stuff, right? We're using HTML5 video at Coursera because we get playback rate, because we can do the speed up buttons. So we're using it there because we're getting a real advantage to using it. So if there is a real advantage in terms of performance or productivity, right? Like, border radius, I'm going to use that and just not care if it doesn't work in other browsers, right? Because I get a big advantage there and not a big decrease. So it's a balance.
Thank you.
Regarding your fancy CSS woes, did you file any bugs?
So did I file bugs on the Android whiteout?
Was it Chrome or was it the Android browser?
This was Android WebKit. So the thing is, when you're doing PhoneGap, you have to use the embedded web view, which means using the Android WebKit, also known as like the worst WebKit ever. There were a lot of issues with that WebKit. I think I filed some issues on that, but I don't know if I filed on the whiteout in particular, because it's something where you'd have to give them the test case, and it's kind of sometimes it can be really complex to come up with the test cases for people, and I feel bad reporting bugs without a really nice test case for it, so I probably didn't.
I gotcha. Cool. We'd like to help fix those.
Nice. Cool. Anything else? All right. How many of you use Modernizer now? Cool. Any of you guys do UA parser? Oh, we got one. Yeah, I actually had never even heard of it before, so. Why doesn't Modernizer have an is Flash? So there's a whole issue on it. So this is what I recommend. Like when you use Modernizer, you'll find it doesn't have checks for, there's lots of things it doesn't have checks for, right? Many of the things I check for these days, like playback rate on the video element, Modernizer doesn't have that. But if you look in the issue tracker, you will often find discussions about it, right? So anytime you use a library, look in the issue tracker, right? So I always look in the issue tracker. So you gotta look and see what are the common issues that people are having, right? To see, oh, is that something that's going to hit me too? And also look for interesting discussions, especially with Modernizer. And I also look to see just when people respond to issues, if they're nice or if they're mean. Because if I'm thinking about using a library and all the responses on the issue tracker are kind of mean, then I don't use it. So I definitely check out, when I'm thinking of using a library, I check out their issue tracker and their code history fairly thoroughly, right? Because anytime you use a library, it's an investment. Because you'll encounter issues with it. So they don't have a Flash support, but they do have a long thread about it, and I followed a few links from there, but in the end, Swift Object was the best option. It's the most accurate. Cool. All right. You're free to go.